I've always believed that some people are born with quiet lives stitched into their skin. Lives that don't demand much more than clocking in, smiling politely, and hoping the world doesn't notice them. That was me. The girl who worked the graveyard shift at Lenny's diner, where the coffee tasted like burnt prayers and the neon sign outside buzzed louder than the customers ever spoke. I liked it that way. Safe, predictable, invisible. I didn't know that invisibility could vanish in a single glance, or that one man's gaze could feel like being caught in the beam of an oncoming train you never saw coming. It was a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday, the kind of night where the clock above the register seemed to sigh instead of tick, where rain left streaks down the glass like tears that refused to fall. The regulars were there, truckers slumped over their mugs, 2 teenagers sharing a milkshake they couldn't afford, and old Mr. Nolan in his corner booth tapping his spoon to get my attention. He was deaf, sweet, and the only man who ever left me thank you notes written in shaky block letters on napkins. I signed to him slowly. "You want more pie?" And he nodded, grinning like a child. That was the small kind of magic I lived for. Kindness no one noticed, gestures that spoke louder than words. Then the door opened, and the magic died. They entered like a storm. 5 men in black suits that didn't belong in a place where fries came in greasy baskets and laughter smelled like onions. The diner went silent in the way people do when danger enters the room wearing an expensive watch. Their leader, tall, dark, sculpted from stillness, didn't look around as he sat at the far booth. His men flanked him, eyes sharp, scanning exits, measuring everyone's worth in glances. The air thickened. My hands trembled so hard the coffee pot rattled against its handle. I didn't know his name then, but I'd heard it whispered before, in the kind of half-stories women tell when they want to sound like they've brushed against danger but lived to brag about it. Dante Moretti, the heir to the Moretti crime family. The kind of man who didn't have to raise his voice to command a room. Silence did it for him. I tried to hide behind my notepad, tried to be just another waitress with a tired smile and a trembling pen. But when his eyes lifted, dark and unreadable, like the surface of oil in moonlight, something inside me stumbled. He didn't just look at me. He looked through me, as if he could see all the things I'd ever tried to hide. The fear, the longing, the exhaustion of carrying too much alone. "Coffee," he said, his voice low, rough velvet over steel. I nodded too quickly. "Black." He arched one brow, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not a smile, just a quiet mockery of one. "Naturally." When I brought the pot to the table, my hands wouldn't steady, and he noticed. Of course, he did. His gaze lingered on the faint tremor of my fingers as I poured, on the tiny scar near my wrist I'd gotten from a broken plate last month. He studied me like a man memorizing something that would matter later. His men didn't speak. They just watched him watch me, as though even their breathing depended on his permission. He stayed for exactly 13 minutes. No food, just 1 cup of coffee and silence that made me question every sound I made. When he finally stood, he reached into his jacket, and I swear my heart stopped. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small black card and placed it on the counter beside the tip jar. The edges gleamed like inked glass, and embossed in silver were 2 words, Dante Moretti. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. When the bell above the door jingled as he left, the air came rushing back like a wave that had been holding itself in. I didn't touch the card for hours. I didn't even tell anyone. I just kept working until my shift ended, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was flirting, maybe it was a coincidence, maybe I was paranoid. But when I stepped outside at dawn, the sky pale and aching over the city, I felt something watching me from the dark across the street. A black car idled, headlights off. My skin prickled. I walked faster, my keys shaking in my hand like wind chimes in a storm. Home was a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like bleach and hope. My sister Emma was asleep on the couch, schoolbooks spread across her chest, headphones still in. I tucked a blanket over her, kissed her forehead, and told myself everything was fine, that the world of men like Dante Moretti didn't touch girls like me. But fear has a way of whispering in your ear, even when you try to ignore it. It tells you you're already seen, already chosen. That night, when I woke up to the sound of glass breaking, I thought it was just the wind. I wanted it to be the wind. But the front door was ajar, and the soft hum of my refrigerator was the only thing filling the silence. My breath came shallow as I stepped into the living room. Nothing was missing. Not the TV, not the cash in the drawer. Just the sense of safety that used to live here. And then I saw it. On the kitchen table lay a manila envelope sealed with a black wax insignia, a lion's head. Inside was a typed contract, crisp and cold. I skimmed the words, my eyes catching on phrases that made my stomach twist. Personal assistant to Lucia Moretti, full-time residence required, non-disclosure clause, salary, $300,000 annually, $300,000. My hands shook. It was more money than I'd see in a lifetime of double shifts. At the bottom, a single line waited for my signature, and beneath it, the same name embossed in silver ink, Dante Moretti. There was no note, no instructions, just the quiet understanding that someone had been in my home, that they could come back, and that I wasn't being asked. All night I sat there, staring at the paper while the city outside whispered and breathed, wondering what kind of woman I would become if I signed it. The kind who ran from danger, or the kind who stepped into it. I thought about Emma, about our overdue rent, about the fear that had lived under my ribs for so long it had begun to feel like a second heartbeat. And then, as dawn bled pink through the blinds, I picked up the pen. When the ink hit the paper, it felt like slicing my own fate open. I didn't know that the moment I signed my name, I stopped being a waitress. I became property, a possession owned by a family that traded in silence and blood. And as the city yawned awake and the first rays of sun touched that cursed contract, I had no idea that by nightfall I would be standing in front of the Moretti mansion, and that the woman waiting behind its gilded doors would change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and fear. I remember the sound of the gates closing behind me, not just the heavy grind of metal on stone, but the finality of it. The way it echoed through me like the sound of a lock clicking shut somewhere deep inside my soul. It was the kind of sound that told you there was no turning back, no slipping out unnoticed, no pretending that what you'd done could be undone. The black car that had picked me up before sunrise was gone now, its taillights dissolving into the mist, leaving me standing in the courtyard of a mansion that looked less like a home and more like a monument to everything money and power could buy or destroy. The Moretti estate wasn't just large, it was imposing, the kind of place where even the air seemed to obey unseen rules. The walls were old and white, though the word white felt wrong. It was the kind of color that had aged with time, faded into something almost sorrowful, like the remnants of a life once lived loudly, but now existing only in whispers. Ivy crawled up the sides, green veins cutting through marble like the slow reclaiming of nature over arrogance. The fountain in the center of the courtyard no longer sang. The water had frozen into stillness, mirroring the emptiness of the place. I stood there with my suitcase in hand, my throat dry. The contract folded neatly inside my coat pocket as if proximity might make it less terrifying, less binding. But the moment I looked up at the massive front doors, I knew that nothing, not hesitation, not hope, not even prayer, would free me from what I'd just stepped into. The butler who answered didn't smile. He was tall, silver-haired, with eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. Without a word, he motioned for me to follow. And I did, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor like confessions. The air inside was colder than outside. Not from temperature, but from absence, as though warmth itself had been banished. The hallways were long and dimly lit, lined with portraits of stern-faced men and graceful women, each painted with the precision of love, but the emotion of duty. Their eyes followed me as I passed, and for a moment I thought I could hear whispers, the sound of old secrets pressing against the walls, waiting to be remembered. The butler stopped at a pair of ornate double doors and signed something quickly with his hands, a gesture I almost recognized but couldn't place. Then he opened the door and stepped aside, allowing me to enter. She was sitting by the window, her profile cut against the soft glow of morning light, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of poise that only comes from a lifetime of control. Lucia Moretti, the infamous matriarch, the widow of the late Don Moretti, and the mother of the man whose shadow had already begun to stain my life. She was beautiful in a way that was almost painful, the kind of beauty time couldn't ruin, not delicate but deliberate, sculpted from willpower and grief. Her hair was silver white, pinned in an elegant twist, and her eyes, pale, sharp, and watchful, seemed to hold entire conversations without uttering a word. When she turned toward me, I felt the weight of her silence before I understood it. The butler signed to her. Her gaze moved to me, assessing, curious, not unkind, but not gentle either. Then, with graceful precision, she began to sign. "You are Isla Romano." Her movements were fluid, confident, and though I hadn't practiced since I was a child, my hands instinctively lifted, shaky but eager, as if remembering an old song. "Yes," I signed back, my fingers trembling. "I am." A faint smile touched her lips. Not approval exactly, but recognition, like she was measuring me against something she'd already decided about me. She signed again, slower this time, as if giving me space to follow. "You worked at the diner. You spoke to the man who could not hear." I nodded, feeling warmth creep into my cheeks. "Yes, Mr. Nolan. He's kind." Her smile deepened, and her eyes softened in a way that startled me. It was the look of someone who had known isolation for so long that kindness had become a foreign language. She gestured toward the seat across from her. I sat. For the next hour, we spoke in silence, hands weaving stories, faces carrying meaning words could never hold. She told me she'd lost her hearing 20 years ago after an illness, that she'd tried to learn to live without sound, but the people around her had learned to live without listening. That most days, she preferred the quiet because it told the truth better than voices ever could. I told her about Emma, about working nights, about how I'd learned a bit of sign language when my neighbor's daughter was deaf, how it made me feel connected in a way speaking never did. And as I spoke, Lucia's expression changed, curiosity shifting to something softer, something almost maternal. For the first time since signing that cursed contract, I didn't feel afraid. Until the door opened. Dante Moretti stood in the doorway, like he'd always belonged there. Tall, sharp, immaculate in his dark suit. The same cold authority wrapped around him like a second skin. His eyes moved first to his mother, then to me, narrowing slightly as if the sight of me sitting comfortably in his world was somehow an offense. Lucia signed to him with quick, decisive movements. His jaw tightened, but he nodded, then looked at me. "My mother likes you," he said, voice quiet but weighted. "That doesn't happen often." I swallowed hard. "She's wonderful," I managed, though the word felt too small for the presence that woman carried. Dante's gaze lingered, too steady, too knowing. "You'll stay in the East Wing," he said. "My mother's rooms are there. You'll assist her daily. Meals, walks, correspondence. You'll go nowhere else unless instructed." He said it all so calmly, but underneath that composure was something darker, coiled and patient. the way a predator speaks when the prey hasn't realized it's cornered. Lucia signed something that made him sigh, a sharp, exasperated sound that cracked the tension like lightning. "She insists you eat dinner with us," he translated flatly. "I warned her you're not ready for this house, but she never listens." I wanted to protest, to say I'd be fine eating in the kitchen, to remind him I was staff, not family, but Lucia's expression told me that refusal wasn't an option. Dinner that evening was silence and silver, a long table with too many empty chairs, candlelight dancing against crystal, the kind of meal that demanded stillness instead of appetite. Dante sat across from me, eyes unreadable, posture flawless, his every movement deliberate. Lucia's hands moved occasionally in gentle conversation, and I responded, grateful for her presence like a lifeline in a storm. But every time I looked up, Dante was watching me. Not cruelly, not even intently, just constantly, like he was trying to decide what I was made of. When the meal ended, Lucia excused herself, signing something about rest, and the butler guided her away. The moment she was gone, the silence between us changed shape. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was electric. Dante leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. "My mother trusts you," he said softly, "which means I have to know why." I don't know," I stammered. She said she felt comfortable with me." His eyes darkened. "No one feels comfortable here unless they're lying. So tell me, Miss Romano, are you lying to her? Or to me?" My heart pounded. "Neither," I whispered. "I just needed the job." He smiled, a slow, dangerous curve that didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone who walks through these doors thinks they need something. Money, safety, redemption. But what they don't understand is that the house decides what they actually came for." And with that he stood, leaving his glass untouched, his voice like smoke fading into the cold air as he walked away. I sat there alone, staring at the flickering candles, the taste of fear and curiosity twisting together in my chest. Somewhere above, the wind whispered against the old windows, and for the first time I thought I heard something. Not sound exactly, but something deeper. A vibration that crawled through the floorboards, faint but insistent. It was crying. Soft, muffled, coming from somewhere down the hall, the forbidden east wing. And in that moment I understood what Dante meant. The house was already deciding what I had come for. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Not the kind of sleep that heals or softens, but the restless half-sleep of someone who feels the walls breathing around her, who senses that silence can be louder than any scream. The room they'd given me was elegant in a way that didn't invite comfort. A 4-poster bed draped in pale linen, a chandelier that swayed faintly with every shift of the wind, and windows so tall they looked like portals to another world. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't mine. And every creak of the old house seemed to whisper that I didn't belong here. I lay there, eyes open to the dark, listening. First to the faint hum of electricity in the walls, then to the ticking of the antique clock on the dresser, and finally to the sound that had kept me awake since dinner. That quiet, persistent weeping that seemed to bleed through the walls, soft and uneven, like the voice of someone who'd forgotten how to cry, but couldn't stop anyway. At first, I told myself it was the wind, maybe the way it slipped through the gaps in the window frame, catching in the pipes, turning into something almost human. But as the night stretched thinner, the sound grew clearer, distinct, unmistakably human, and heartbreakingly real. I got up, the wooden floor cool beneath my bare feet, and pulled my robe around me, the silk whispering against my skin like a warning. The hallway beyond my door was dimly lit by wall sconces that flickered with the unease of candlelight, trapped behind glass, throwing strange shadows that danced along the portraits of dead Morettis, who seemed to watch me with disapproval. Lucia's wing was silent, her door closed, her nurse's cot empty. I hesitated, knowing Dante's words still rang through the walls. You'll go nowhere else unless instructed. But fear has its own kind of gravity and curiosity. That dangerous, shimmering thing pulls harder when you know you shouldn't move. The crying was coming from the east side of the mansion, the forbidden corridor Dante had warned me never to enter. I told myself I'd only go a few steps, just far enough to convince myself it was a trick of the wind. But each footstep carried me deeper, until the familiar hallway gave way to a narrower passage lined with doors that looked untouched for decades. The wallpaper peeled in places, the air colder, heavier, filled with the faint scent of dust and something else. Old smoke, maybe, or memory. The sound grew louder, not wailing, not frantic, but sorrowful, fragile. The sound of someone who'd run out of reasons to hope. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as I reached for the nearest door. It was locked, the handle unmoving beneath my palm. I tried another. Also locked. Then just as I turned back, I saw it. A sliver of light under a door at the very end of the hall, trembling faintly, like a candle flame fighting to survive. I took a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and moved closer. The crying stopped the moment my shadow touched the door, replaced by a low murmur. Voices, 2 of them, one rough, one pleading. Then I heard his voice. Dante's. It wasn't like the calm, calculated tone he used with me or his mother. It was rougher, stripped raw by anger, by grief maybe. I couldn't tell. You should have stayed quiet, he said, the words muffled by the wood but sharp enough to make my pulse quicken. Now you've made it worse for both of us. There was the sound of movement, a scuffle, a thud, then silence. I pressed my ear closer, my breath fogging against the cold wood. Dante, please! A man's voice rasped, weak, afraid. You know I didn't... The rest was cut off by something heavy striking flesh. I flinched, covering my mouth to stifle the gasp that tore through me. For a few seconds there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then Dante spoke again. Quieter this time, his voice trembling not with rage but something far worse. You took everything from her. You took him from me. So now you'll understand what silence feels like. My stomach turned cold. I didn't know who he was talking to or what he meant, but I knew I shouldn't be here. I backed away, slowly, carefully, every instinct screaming at me to run before he stepped out and found me, before he looked at me with those eyes that saw too much. But as I turned, my foot caught the edge of a loose floorboard. A faint creak, barely audible, but enough. The voices stopped. My heart dropped. The light under the door vanished, and then the sound of the lock sliding open. I ran, not fast, not loud, just desperate enough to make it back to my room before the echo of his footsteps reached the corner. I closed the door quietly, pressing my back to it, swallowing the panic that rose like fire in my chest. For a long time, I didn't move. When morning came, sunlight spilled into the room, soft and golden, pretending the night hadn't happened. Lucia's nurse knocked on my door, signing that breakfast would be served in the garden. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd dreamed it. The crying, the voices, the cold terror that still sat heavy in my stomach. But when I walked into the hall, I saw him. Dante was standing by the window at the end of the corridor, sleeves rolled up, a faint smear of red near his cuff. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me stop breathing. He turned, and when his gaze met mine, there was no surprise, only calculation. Sleep well? He asked softly, his tone polite, casual, almost kind. But there was an edge beneath it, the kind of edge that cuts when you lean too close. I nodded, my voice stuck somewhere between fear and fascination. Yes, I lied. He studied me for a moment, and I could feel him seeing right through it. Then, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, he stepped closer. "You're pale," he said, reaching out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my cheek with a touch that was too gentle to be innocent. "The house can be unsettling at night. I told you to stay in your room." The way he said it wasn't a reprimand. It was a promise, or maybe a warning. I forced a smile, murmured something about old buildings creaking, and excused myself to find Lucia. The garden was a world apart, sunlight glinting off fountains, roses heavy with dew, birdsong weaving through the air like an apology for everything that existed beyond those hedges. Lucia sat by the table, wrapped in a shawl, smiling when she saw me. She signed a greeting, asking if I'd slept well. I hesitated, then decided against mentioning the night. She looked fragile today, pale, distracted, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her tea. But then she signed something that made my chest tighten. "Don't trust my son." My breath caught. I froze. She looked at me with such piercing intensity I almost forgot how to respond. "Why?" I signed, barely managing the word. Her expression softened into sadness. "He protects what he loves in the wrong ways," she signed slowly, carefully. "And sometimes he destroys what he doesn't want to lose." Before I could ask more, Dante appeared again, his presence like the sudden eclipse of sunlight. "Mother," he said, his voice a low current of command. "You shouldn't be outside too long. The air's too cold." She ignored him, her eyes on me, pleading in silence. But Dante's gaze followed hers, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker there. A warning, a question, a promise all tangled together. When he helped her inside, his hand brushed mine, deliberate, lingering. "Stay away from the east wing," he murmured, low enough for only me to hear. "Next time you go there, I won't be as forgiving." His breath was warm against my ear, but his words were ice. And as I watched him lead his mother away, I realized that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the living, by the things they'd done, and by the secrets that clung to the walls like blood that no one had bothered to clean. That night, when the lights went out and the silence returned, I lay awake again. But this time, the crying didn't come from the hall. It came from my own chest, because I finally understood that whatever Dante Moretti was hiding behind those locked doors, it wasn't just danger. It was pain, and it was calling to me. There are moments in life when fear becomes so familiar that it begins to lose its shape, when it stops being a sharp blade against your throat and becomes something quieter, heavier, like a weight you learn to carry without noticing anymore. That was what the days inside the Moretti mansion became for me. A slow surrender to a kind of silence that wasn't peace but punishment. Every morning, the same routine, breakfast with Lucia, her soft hands signing stories of her youth, her laughter silent but radiant. Then long afternoons spent walking through the overgrown gardens, where ivy clung to statues like memories that refused to die. And always, always the feeling that eyes were on me, watching from behind the gauzy curtains or from the dark windows of rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. Lucia had a way of making the silence beautiful, though, of turning it into something alive, as if she had learned to listen to the spaces between breaths, rather than the sounds themselves. When she signed, her hands spoke with the grace of a dancer and the authority of a queen. And I often forgot that she couldn't hear the wind moving through the trees or the birds calling above us, because she saw the world in movement, in expression, in rhythm. And it made me want to see it that way too. Sometimes, when she grew tired, she would rest in the shade and ask me to read aloud, even though she couldn't hear my voice. She said she liked to watch my mouth move, that it reminded her of lullabies she used to hum to Dante when he was small, before the world taught him that softness was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. I would read poetry, lines about love and loss and time, and I would wonder what it meant for a woman like her, who had lost a husband to violence and a son to the darkness it left behind, to still believe in beauty. But Dante was never far, even when he pretended to be. He was a shadow that threaded through every corner of that house. Quiet, calculating, impossible to ignore. Some days I'd catch sight of him from the balcony, walking the perimeter of the estate with the easy grace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. And other days he would appear suddenly beside me in the hallway, his presence stealing the air from the room before he even spoke. There was something about him that felt both magnetic and unbearable. The way he could look at me without touching me and still make my pulse stumble. The way his voice, low and deliberate, seemed to curl around the spaces between words like smoke that refused to dissipate. And yet, no matter how many times I tried to remind myself of what he was, dangerous, cruel, a man built from the ruins of other people's mistakes, there was a part of me that couldn't stop searching for the cracks in his armor, the pieces of humanity he tried so hard to bury beneath control. It was one of those fragile afternoons when I saw it. That crack, though it appeared in the unlikeliest of ways. Lucia had fallen asleep in her chair beneath the cherry blossom tree, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her fingers still resting in mid-sign. I went inside to fetch a blanket, and as I turned the corner into the main hall, I heard raised voices. Dante's among them, sharp and furious, though not the way he'd sounded that night in the East Wing. This was restrained fury, the kind you feel in your bones long before you see it on someone's face. I hesitated, half hidden by the doorframe. "You don't touch her," Dante was saying, his voice like broken glass dragged across velvet. "You don't look at her. You don't speak to her unless I say so. Do you understand me?" The man he was speaking to, one of his guards, I thought, muttered something I couldn't make out, but Dante's reaction was immediate and violent. He slammed him against the wall, one hand gripping his throat, his other clenched in a fist that trembled with the effort not to strike. "She's off limits," he hissed, so low I barely heard it. "If you even breathe in her direction again, I'll make sure you forget how to draw breath entirely." I stumbled backward, heart racing, heat rushing to my face, not just from fear but from the realization that he was talking about me. When the guard was dismissed, Dante turned and saw me standing there. His expression changed. The anger vanished, replaced by something unreadable, something that made my stomach twist. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. But the softness didn't feel like gentleness. It felt like warning. "I came for a blanket," I said, my voice thin and useless. He nodded, eyes flickering briefly to the basket in my hand, then back to my face. "My mother?" "She's sleeping," I whispered. "In the garden." He exhaled slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, his shoulders seemed to lower, the weight of his name, his legacy, pressing less heavily on his frame. He looked tired, not physically, but in a way that went deeper, as though weariness had become part of who he was. "Stay with her," he said finally, turning away, his tone softer now. "She likes you. And you don't?" The words escaped me before I could stop them, impulsive, reckless, and yet I couldn't take them back. He paused, hand resting on the banister, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting across his lips. "I don't have the luxury of liking people, Miss Romano. Not anymore." He left before I could respond, and I stood there, shaken by how easily his voice could make warmth sound like danger. That night, it rained. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that beats against the windows like it's trying to break through. The kind that turns the air heavy with the scent of earth and electricity. Lucia went to bed early, her strength waning with each passing day, and I found myself alone in the library, drawn there by some instinct I didn't yet understand. The shelves were impossibly tall. filled with books whose spines gleamed with gold lettering. Stories of love and betrayal and war. Reflections, maybe, of the lives that had played out within these walls. I ran my fingers along the titles, feeling the dust, the history, and then stopped when I found one lying open on the table, an old volume of Italian poetry, the pages lined with faint notes in the margins. Dante's handwriting. I sank into the chair, reading the words he'd underlined, verses about silence, about grief, about love that refused to die even when everything else did. For a man who'd claimed he didn't believe in softness, his notes betrayed him. They were tender, aching, human. I didn't hear him enter, but I felt him. The shift in the air, the sudden stillness that followed. "You read," he said, his voice somewhere behind me, low, unguarded. I turned slowly, caught between guilt and curiosity. "I didn't mean to pry," I murmured. "It was open." He stepped closer, the faint scent of rain clinging to him, the top buttons of his shirt undone. "That's my mother's favorite book," he said, though his eyes never left mine. "She used to read it to me before I stopped believing in poetry." I wanted to ask why he'd stopped, but something in his face told me the answer would hurt to hear. Instead, I said softly, "It's beautiful." "So are dangerous things," he replied, his tone so calm it frightened me more than any threat could have. He moved closer, close enough that I could feel his breath, see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You think you understand this house," he murmured, "but you don't. You think you can separate me from it, from what I am. But everything here, the silence, the walls, even my mother's kindness, it all comes with a price." His hand lifted, hovering near my cheek but not quite touching. "And I'm not sure you're ready to pay it." For a long moment, neither of us moved, the storm outside pounding against the glass like a heartbeat too big for the sky. Then, without another word, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall like fading thunder. I sat there long after he was gone, the scent of rain and danger still clinging to the air, the open book before me trembling slightly in the breeze from the open window. And as lightning illuminated the room in flashes of white and shadow, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit, that I was no longer afraid of Dante Moretti. I was fascinated by him. And fascination, in a house like this, was just another word for ruin. There are houses that breathe, houses that hold their secrets like blood in their walls, houses that remember the sins of the people who built them. And the Moretti mansion, I realized, was one of them. Every room hummed with memories that didn't belong to me but pressed against my skin all the same, a living history made of whispers and footsteps and doors that seemed to close just a second too late. I could feel it, always, even when the sun poured through the tall windows and turned the marble floors to gold. The sense that I was being watched not just by the living, but by the past itself, restless and unforgiving. Lucia had grown weaker in the days since the storm, her cough returning, her hands trembling as she signed. I tried to keep her spirits high, reading to her, walking with her through the garden whenever the weather allowed, but I could see the exhaustion creeping through her bones like ivy wrapping around old stone. She smiled less often now, though when she did, it was softer, quieter, the kind of smile people give when they've already begun to say goodbye in ways words can't manage. It was during one of those evenings, when the sky burned the color of bruised peaches and the cicadas sang like a heartbeat, that she reached for my hand, her fingers trembling, her eyes distant but clear. She signed, slowly, deliberately, "Promise me something, Kara." I nodded, my throat tight. "Anything, if something happens to me," she signed, her gaze flicking toward the east wing for the briefest moment. "Don't believe what he tells you. The truth is in the forbidden hall. Promise me you'll find it." I froze, her words sinking into me like ice water, But before I could ask what she meant, Dante appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his voice low but commanding as he said, "Mother, you shouldn't tire yourself. Isla, it's late." Lucia's hands fell still, and she gave me a small, secret look, one that said later, though I knew that in this house, later wasn't always promised. That night I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. The East Wing. The truth. What could possibly be hidden there that Lucia feared her own son might lie about? I remembered the sound of crying, the muffled argument, the locked doors. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away. Dante's warning echoing in my head like a curse. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when it grows out of care, and I cared for Lucia more than I had any right to. When midnight came, I rose from my bed, wrapped my robe tight, and slipped into the hallway. The mansion was dark, its silence thick and suffocating, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire still burning somewhere far below. I moved carefully, my steps light on the carpet, my breath shallow, the contract I'd signed feeling heavier in my mind than ever. The East Wing lay behind a set of double doors carved with intricate lions, the Moretti crest, their eyes seeming to glimmer in the faint candlelight. My hand hesitated on the handle, half expecting it to be locked like before, but this time it turned easily, and I felt a cold draft wash over me, carrying the scent of old books and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Blood, or maybe rust, I couldn't tell. The hallway beyond was darker than the rest of the house, the light fading the farther I went, the air colder, the silence denser. The portraits here were different, not proud family patriarchs, but children, women, people whose faces seemed softer, sadder, as though they'd been painted by someone who loved them too much. Dust clung to every surface, and yet I could feel that someone had been here recently. A faint trail of footprints on the floor, a door slightly ajar at the end of the corridor. I pushed it open. Inside was a study, though not like the one downstairs where Dante sometimes read reports and drank in silence. This one felt secret, smaller, cluttered, personal. Papers covered the desk, letters yellowed with age, the air thick with the scent of old ink and secrets. On the far wall hung a painting of Lucia, younger, radiant, a single rose tucked behind her ear, and beside it, a family photograph. My breath caught when I saw it. Lucia, Dante, and a man I recognized from newspaper clippings. Giovanni Moretti, the former Don, the man whose death had built his son's empire of silence. But it wasn't just them. In the corner of the photograph stood another man, my father. My knees nearly gave out. I gripped the edge of the desk, staring at the image until my eyes burned. My father, smiling, his hand on Giovanni's shoulder like they were brothers, allies, something more than the stories I'd been told about him. I remembered my mother whispering about debts, about danger, about running. But she'd never said who we were running from. Now I knew. The Morettis. I pulled open the drawers, searching, desperate for answers that might make sense of the chaos unraveling inside me. Letters, receipts, bank records, all marked with the Moretti seal. Then I found a folder, thick, sealed with black ribbon. My name was written on the top. I untied it with shaking hands. Inside were documents, birth records, contracts, surveillance photos of me at the diner, of Emma at school. My whole life laid out in careful, merciless detail. At the bottom was a single handwritten note, the ink smudged as if written in haste. She doesn't know. Protect her from him. From the truth. L.M. Lucia. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost behind me. The door slammed shut and I turned, the papers falling from my hands, scattering like fallen leaves at my feet. Dante stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, his shirt open at the collar, his eyes dark and unreadable. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was colder than I'd ever heard it. "You shouldn't be here," he said, each word measured, quiet, lethal. "I had to know," I whispered. "My father, he worked for your family." He stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Worked for us? Is that what you think?" He let out a low, humorless laugh that sounded more like pain. "Your father didn't work for us, Isla. He betrayed us." The air between us shifted, heavy with things unspoken. "He was supposed to protect my father," Dante continued, voice trembling despite the control he fought to maintain. "Instead, he sold us out. He sold me out. His betrayal got my father killed." I shook my head, tears burning my eyes. "No, that can't be true." "It's the truth," he snapped, and the sound of it broke something inside me. "My mother brought you here because she feels guilty, because she knows I should have come for you years ago. She thought this—" He gestured around the room, the mansion, everything, would make things right. But nothing makes this right. I wanted to scream, to run, to demand proof. But the look on his face, raw, haunted, stopped me. Beneath the anger, there was grief. And beneath that, something even more dangerous, understanding. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "Why keep me here?" His voice softened, low and sharp as a blade's edge. "Because I didn't know which I wanted more, to hate you or to forgive you." He took another step closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and uneven. "And now," he said, his voice almost breaking, "I don't know which one would destroy me faster." We stood there, trapped in that moment, between truth and ruin, between hate and hunger, until he turned away suddenly, his hand slamming against the wall with a sound that echoed like thunder. "Get out," he said, his voice low but final, "before I decide which one wins." I ran, down the hall, through the doors, back into the quiet part of the mansion that no longer felt like sanctuary. My hands shook as I closed my door behind me, my reflection in the mirror pale, unrecognizable. And as I pressed my back against the wall, trembling, I realized something I hadn't before, that Lucia's warning hadn't been about fear. It had been about love. And whatever truth she wanted me to find, it wasn't finished revealing itself. Somewhere in this house, there was still more to uncover. And I was no longer sure whether the thing I feared most was the danger that surrounded Dante Moretti, or the way my heart beat faster every time he was near. I couldn't breathe that night. Not in the way a body is supposed to breathe when it's safe, when it belongs to itself. Every inhale burned like a confession. Every exhale trembled with a name I didn't want to say aloud. Dante's voice, low, broken, furious, echoed through my mind long after I'd shut my door and buried myself under the weight of my own fear. I'd thought I understood what kind of story I'd stepped into when I signed that contract. But I hadn't. I hadn't known that I was the living piece of someone else's tragedy, the ghost of a betrayal that had destroyed everything they'd loved. The storm that had lingered outside the mansion for days had quieted to a soft drizzle, the kind of rain that falls like a lullaby over the dead. I sat by the window, staring at the gardens below where water pooled in the cobblestones, catching the faint light of the moon. Everything felt wrong. Even the silence, once strange but comforting, had changed its shape. It no longer held peace. It held tension, like the pause before a scream. When dawn came, pale and bruised, I went to Lucia's room. I didn't know what I wanted from her. Answers, comfort, forgiveness. But I knew she was the only person who could tell me if Dante's words were true. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before entering, afraid of what I might find. Lucia sat by the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, Her face turned toward the morning light. Her hair glowed silver in the soft sun, and for a moment, she looked almost peaceful, as though the sickness that had been eating away at her had loosened its hold. When she turned to me, her eyes filled with quiet knowing, I realized she'd expected me. "You know," she signed, her hands slow, trembling. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "He told me everything," I signed back, though the words felt heavy, wrong, incomplete. Lucia's eyes softened with something that might have been sorrow or relief. She motioned for me to sit beside her, and when I did, she reached for my hand, her skin papery and cold, her touch still impossibly gentle. "He is not wrong," she signed, "but he does not know everything either." The words hit me like wind. I searched her face for some clue, some thread of clarity, but she looked out the window again, her fingers moving with deliberate grace. "Your father—" "He did betray Giovanni," she signed slowly. "But it was not for money. It was for you. For your mother." I blinked, trying to make sense of it. "Giovanni wanted power. He was becoming dangerous," she continued, her gaze distant, her signs breaking slightly as her hands trembled. "Your father found out about a shipment, weapons meant to start a war with the Rossi family. He tried to stop it. He begged Giovanni to call it off, but Giovanni would not. So your father warned the police. He thought it would end without blood. He was wrong." The words fell like stones. My pulse thundered in my ears. "My father tried to save people," I signed, the hope in the words small, fragile, desperate. Lucia nodded. "He tried. But Giovanni died because of it. And Dante." She paused, her expression tightening in pain. "Dante watched his father die. He has never forgiven that. Not your father, not himself, not me. I couldn't speak, couldn't move." The world tilted, every piece of my past shifting into a shape I didn't recognize. My father, the man I'd thought of as quiet, ordinary, broken, had been part of something bigger, darker, and now I understood why my mother had been so afraid, why she'd never let us stay in one place too long. We'd been running not from danger, but from retribution. Lucia signed again, slower this time, her eyes glistening. "He will hate you for what you represent, but he will also love you for the same reason. It is how he was made." I wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that love and hate couldn't live in the same body, but I already knew that wasn't true. I'd felt it. The way Dante looked at me, the way his touch had hovered between violence and longing, the way every word from him felt like both a warning and a confession. Lucia leaned closer, her breath shallow, her lips parting slightly before her hands formed one last sign. "Don't let him destroy himself again." Before I could ask what she meant, her nurse entered, fussing over her, and the moment was gone. I left quietly, but her words clung to me like smoke. That afternoon, I found Dante in the stables, his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with dirt and something darker, his expression set in that same impossible mask. He didn't look up when I approached. He just kept working, tightening the strap of a saddle with slow, deliberate precision. "I talked to your mother," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "She told me the truth." He froze for a second, then turned, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. Cold, exhausted, beautiful. "Her truth," he said quietly. "She always had one. She said my father tried to stop the war, that he didn't want Giovanni dead." Dante's jaw clenched. "And yet he died anyway. Do you think that makes it better?" "No," I whispered. "But it makes it different." He exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the stall. "You don't understand, Isla. My father wasn't a good man, but he was mine. When he died, I was the one who had to hold my mother together. I was the one who had to step into his place. Every deal, every threat, every drop of blood spilled since that day. It's all been because of what your father did." There was so much anger in his words, but beneath it, I heard something else. Exhaustion, guilt, a longing he didn't know how to name. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Not as an apology for something I hadn't done, but for the weight both of us were carrying. For a long moment he didn't speak. The rain outside softened to a whisper, the world narrowing until it was just us, the scent of hay and storm and grief hanging between us. Then he said quietly, "Do you know why my mother brought you here?" I shook my head. "She thought if I saw you, if I looked at you and remembered you were innocent, maybe I'd stop hating the past. But she doesn't understand. You look like peace, Isla, but you feel like punishment." His words stole the air from my lungs. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space like thunder waiting to break. "I've tried to stay away from you," he said, his voice low, raw, trembling at the edges. "But every time I look at you, I remember that night. And every time I remember that night, I don't know whether I want to protect you or ruin you." "Dante," I started. But the way he looked at me silenced everything else. His hand came up, brushing against my cheek. The lightest touch, hesitant, almost reverent. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "You shouldn't be anywhere near me." "Maybe not," I said, the words catching in my throat. "But I am." And that was enough. For a heartbeat, one endless, dangerous heartbeat, we stood there, the space between us collapsing, our breaths mingling, the air heavy with everything we couldn't say. I could feel the storm of him, the chaos beneath the calm, and before I could stop myself, I leaned closer. His lips brushed mine. Not a kiss, not yet, but a promise, a question neither of us had the courage to answer. Then he pulled away, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You think you see me, but you don't. And when you do, you'll wish you never had." He left before I could speak, disappearing into the rain like a shadow. And I stood there, my heart breaking for both of us, knowing that whatever truth lay beneath the blood that tied our families together, it wasn't finished with us yet. I remember the storm that night not for its violence, but for its intimacy. How it wrapped around the mansion like a secret, whispering against the windows, weaving through the hallways with fingers of rain and wind that seemed to know my name. It wasn't a storm meant to destroy. It was one meant to cleanse, to strip away the lies that had built this house brick by brick until only the truth remained, naked and unforgiving. But truth, I was learning, is never gentle, and when it comes, it doesn't knock softly. It tears the doors from their hinges and demands to be seen. Lucia had fallen ill again, her breathing labored, her skin pale as porcelain, her once steady hands trembling like fragile wings. I'd spent the day by her side, reading to her from the poetry book Dante had once annotated, the margins filled with his younger handwriting. Softer, more hopeful, unscarred by blood and memory. Every so often her eyes would drift toward the door as if waiting for him to appear, and though he never did, I could feel his presence everywhere, in the echo of footsteps outside her room, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath when I whispered his name in my mind. By evening, the nurse insisted I rest, but rest had become a stranger to me. I wandered through the mansion's corridors, barefoot, the floor cold beneath my feet, the storm outside murmuring like an old ghost. The candles along the walls flickered as I passed, their flames bending toward me as though pulled by something, unseen. I didn't intend to find him. I think part of me was always searching for him, even when I didn't know it, drawn to the sound of quiet, drawn to the shadow that moved like a heartbeat through the house. He was in his father's study, the forbidden one, The room that smelled of cigar smoke and old whiskey, and the sharp metallic tang of memory. The door was open just enough for the light inside to spill into the hall. A soft amber glow against the dark. I hesitated, but only for a breath. Then I stepped inside. He stood by the fireplace, his back to me, the flicker of flames tracing gold along the edges of his face and shoulders. His jacket hung on the chair beside him, his shirt sleeves rolled up, exposing the ink that wound around his forearms like vines. Names, symbols, things I didn't yet understand but wanted to. He didn't turn when I entered, though I knew he'd felt me the moment I crossed the threshold. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice low, rough, already too close. "You always say that," I whispered, stepping closer. "And yet you never send me away." He turned then slowly, his eyes catching the firelight, dark, feverish, haunted. "Maybe I should," he said. "Maybe I should have from the beginning." The silence stretched, filled with everything neither of us could say. I could feel my heart in my throat, each beat a fragile rebellion against reason. "She's getting worse," I said, my voice breaking the stillness. "Lucia, she needs you." "I know," he murmured, staring into the fire again. "But she doesn't want to see me like this." "Like what?" "Like a man who doesn't know what to do with his own mother dying," he said, the words cracked and raw. "Like a man who's built an empire out of the ashes of a mistake and still can't make it mean anything." He paused, his gaze lifting to mine, something fierce and desperate flickering there. Like a man who wants the one person he can't have. My breath caught, the air thick between us. "Dante," I whispered, his name tasting like both a warning and a prayer. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping inches away, his presence filling the space like a storm contained within skin. His hand came up, trembling slightly, hovering just shy of my face. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said softly, "like I'm worth saving." "You are," I said. And it was the truth. The only truth that mattered in that moment. Something inside him broke. I saw it happen. The mask he wore every day cracking open, the man beneath it bleeding through. He touched me then, his fingers brushing my jaw, trailing down my throat with unbearable tenderness, as if afraid I might vanish. My pulse jumped beneath his touch, and he felt it. I knew he did, because his eyes darkened, his breath unsteady. "I shouldn't want you," he murmured, his voice almost pleading. "Not after what your father did. Not after what I've done." "But you do," I said, because denial had no place left to hide. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, his forehead resting against mine. The warmth of him was dizzying, his scent, smoke, cedar, danger, wrapping around me until I wasn't sure where I ended and he began. When his lips finally met mine, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was a collision. Of grief. Of fury. Of need that had been festering beneath our skin for too long. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as if trying to erase every inch of distance that had ever existed between us. And I let him, because resistance felt like lying to myself. The kiss deepened, became something wild, something that lived in the space between pain and redemption. I could feel every unspoken word, every buried apology, every moment we'd spent pretending we didn't want this. The world outside dissolved. The rain, the thunder, the ghosts in the walls. All of it disappeared until there was nothing but him, his mouth, his breath, his heartbeat against mine. And then as quickly as it began, he tore himself away, stumbling back as though burned. His chest heaved, his eyes wild, his hand dragging across his mouth like he could erase the taste of me. "This," he said, voice shaking. "This can't happen again." "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because I've already ruined too many things, he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. Because everything I touch either dies or disappears. And because if I let myself love you, I won't stop. The word love hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. He turned from me then, facing the fire again, his hands braced on the mantel as if holding himself up by sheer force of will. I watched him, the rise and fall of his shoulders, the trembling that betrayed him, and I knew. He was fighting something bigger than either of us. Dante, I said softly, stepping closer. You can't keep punishing yourself for something you didn't do. He laughed, bitter and broken. Didn't I? Every drop of blood that's been spilled since that night. It's mine, Isla. My father's death, my mother's silence, your family's suffering. It all circles back to me. I'm the thread that ties it together. I reached for him, but he flinched, his jaw tightening. Don't, he said, the word barely audible. Please don't. I don't care who you are, I whispered. I don't care what's happened. You're not the monster you think you are. He turned then, his expression unreadable, his voice almost trembling. And what if I am? Then I'll stay anyway, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Because monsters don't look at me the way you do. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to hold still. The rain suspended mid-air, the thunder silenced. He looked at me as though he didn't know whether to destroy me or worship me. Then he said, so softly I almost missed it. If you stay, there's no turning back. You'll belong to this house. To me. And I should have been afraid. I should have said no, but instead I whispered, maybe I already do. He stared at me for a long, quiet moment, something raw flickering behind his eyes, fear, desire, surrender. And then, without another word, he left the room, the sound of his footsteps fading into the storm. I stood there, trembling, the taste of him still on my lips, the firelight flickering against the tears I hadn't realized were falling. Because even as I told myself it was over, I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever lived between us now was too strong, too dangerous, too alive to be undone by logic or shame. And somewhere deep in the house, I could feel the walls shift, as though the mansion itself knew what we had done, and was waiting, quietly, for the price we would have to pay. The morning Lucia Moretti died began in silence so absolute it felt unnatural, a silence that didn't comfort or soothe but warned, like the pause before the sky breaks open, like the inhale before a scream. Even the birds that usually filled the gardens with song seemed to sense it. That strange, heavy stillness that wrapped itself around the mansion like a shroud, settling into the walls, the curtains, even the air we breathed. I woke before dawn, my body restless though I couldn't say why, and I knew, without knowing how, that something was ending. The corridors were dim, washed in that fragile kind of light that comes before sunrise, when the world isn't quite awake but already aware. My bare feet made no sound on the marble, and yet every step felt like an intrusion, as though I were walking through the final dream of a house that had loved too many ghosts. When I reached Lucia's door, I hesitated, not because I feared what I would find, but because some part of me already knew what waited beyond it. The nurse met me in the doorway, her face pale and trembling, her eyes wet in the candlelight. She asked for you, she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. She's been waiting. I entered quietly, my heart hammering in my chest, and the world seemed to blur around the edges. Lucia lay propped against her pillows, her hair loose around her shoulders, her skin translucent as parchment. But her eyes, oh, her eyes, still burned with the same fierce light I had seen the day I met her. She smiled when she saw me, the faintest curve of lips, fragile but radiant. I went to her side, taking her hand, feeling how cold it was, how fragile. Her fingers curled weakly around mine, and she began to sign, slow and deliberate, each movement a struggle, each gesture weighted with finality. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she signed. "I'll always come." I signed back, my own hands shaking, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. She smiled again, faintly. "You remind me of myself once," she signed, her hands pausing between words as though even memory required effort now. "Brave, foolish, loving the wrong man in the right way." My throat tightened. "You're going to be okay," I signed, though we both knew it was a lie, a kindness neither of us believed in. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the first trace of dawn was painting the horizon in soft gold and gray. "No," she signed. "I'm not. But he will be if you stay." "Dante?" She nodded, the movement small but certain. "He carries the sins of everyone who came before him. He was born into a cage and taught to build his own bars. You are the only thing that makes him forget how to hate." Tears slipped down my cheeks now, unstoppable, the salt burning against my lips. "He won't let me help him," I signed. "He keeps pushing me away." Her eyes softened, a mother's understanding. "He learned that love is weakness. You must teach him that it is survival." For a long time we sat in silence, her breathing shallow, uneven, each exhale sounding like it wanted to be her last. I wanted to call for the nurse, for Dante, for anyone who could stop time from moving forward, but I couldn't leave her. I couldn't let her face death alone in this house of ghosts and gold and unspoken grief. She signed one more time, her hands trembling violently now. "In the drawer. For you." I looked to the bedside table, opened the drawer with shaking fingers, and found a small velvet box. Black, worn, heavy. Inside was a ring, the Moretti crest engraved into its gold surface, the same one I'd seen on Giovanni's hand in old photographs, the symbol of the empire that had consumed them all. "Why are you giving me this?" I signed, my hands unsteady. Her lips moved, no sound coming out, only the faint shape of words I couldn't hear but felt deep in my chest. "Because you are family now." And then, with a long, slow exhale that seemed to empty the room of air, she was gone. The candle by the bed flickered once and went out. For a while, I didn't move. I sat there holding her hand long after the warmth had faded, the dawn creeping across the room like a secret trying to be gentle. When I finally stood, the world seemed quieter than it had ever been. I found Dante in the hallway outside, standing perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He saw it in my face, and for a moment something in him faltered, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the boy he'd once been, the one who had loved his mother more than anything else in the world. He walked past me without a word, into her room, and closed the door. I waited outside, listening to the silence that followed, to the sound of him breaking quietly behind the walls. It wasn't until much later, hours maybe, though time had no meaning anymore, that the door opened again. He came out changed. His eyes were colder, his movements sharper, his grief buried under something harder, something darker. "The doctor will come," he said flatly. "There will be arrangements." "Dante," he cut me off, his voice cracking just slightly. "Don't. Not now." And then he was gone again, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and smoke and sorrow. The mansion transformed over the next day. It was as though the walls themselves mourned her. The curtains drawn, the chandeliers dimmed, the servants moving like shadows. I helped prepare her favorite flowers, white roses and lavender, their scent filling the air, sweet and suffocating. The funeral was to be held on the grounds, private, small, the family name too dangerous, too revered to allow strangers. When I found Dante again, he was standing in the garden where we had once walked with Lucia, staring at the fountain that hadn't run in years. The storm clouds had returned, low and gray, pressing against the horizon like grief too heavy for the sky. "She loved you," I said quietly, stepping beside him. "She wanted you to know that." He didn't look at me. "She loved everyone," he said, "even people who didn't deserve it. She said you do." His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to mine, dark and hollow. "She lied." "She didn't." He turned then, anger flashing through the grief, raw and unbearable. "You don't understand what this means," he said. "When she's gone, there's nothing left to hold this house together. The wolves will come now. They've been waiting for this." "Then let them come," I said, my voice trembling but sure. "You're not alone, Dante." Something in his face softened for a moment, his hand lifting as though he wanted to touch me. But before he could, one of his men appeared at the edge of the garden, his expression grave. "Boss," he said quietly, "there's a problem. We found something." Dante stiffened. "What?" The man hesitated, glancing at me before continuing. "We think she was poisoned." The words hit like thunder, ripping through the still air. Dante's face went white, his body going still in that dangerous way I'd seen before, the way silence becomes a blade. "Who?" he asked, his voice low, calm, deadly. "We don't know yet, but—" The man looked at me again. "There's talk about the girl." For a second I couldn't move. The world tilted, the scent of lavender turning sickly, cloying. Dante's eyes met mine, unreadable, dark, infinite, and I saw in them the flicker of something that wasn't trust. "Leave us," he said to his men, his voice a low command. They obeyed immediately, vanishing into the mist. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "You don't believe them," I whispered. He didn't answer. "Dante," I said, stepping closer, my voice breaking. "Please tell me you don't believe them." He stared at me for a long, unbearable moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough to make the world stop. "I don't want to," he said, "but every time I've trusted someone I loved, they've buried me in blood." The rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, the drops cold against my skin. He turned away, his voice barely audible. "Go to your room, Isla. Don't leave until I tell you to." I wanted to reach for him, to scream, to tell him I'd never hurt her, but the look on his face stopped me. The look of a man teetering on the edge of something he could never come back from. As I walked back through the garden, soaked and shaking, the mansion loomed behind me, vast, mourning, alive, and somewhere in its hollow heart, I knew the house had just chosen its next secret. Grief, I learned, doesn't roar. It doesn't come as the dramatic collapse of a body, or the kind of weeping that shakes walls. It seeps, quiet and relentless, into the cracks of your soul, until you can't tell whether you're still breathing, or just mimicking the act of it. In the days after Lucia's death, the mansion became a mausoleum of shadows and unspoken words, the walls absorbing every whisper of suspicion, every footstep of the men who came and went in black coats and darker intentions. Her funeral had been small, as Dante promised, but even in death, she drew a kind of reverence that transcended fear. People bowed their heads not just because they mourned her, but because they knew she had been the last good thing tethering this family to something resembling mercy. After she was buried beneath the old cypress tree at the edge of the property, everything shifted. The house itself seemed to grow colder, the air sharper, as if it too had lost its heart. Dante didn't speak to me for 2 days. I would see him sometimes, through doorways, across the courtyard, standing in the rain without a coat, his face unreadable, his hands clenched in fists that looked carved from grief. There was no softness in him anymore, none of the quiet restraint I'd glimpsed beneath his fury. He was back to being the man the world feared, and yet there was something fragile in his stillness, a kind of exhaustion that only comes from trying to hate someone you can't stop loving. Rumors rippled through the estate like smoke. Talk of betrayal, of poison, of revenge being the only language Dante still spoke. I heard the servants whisper my name when they thought I couldn't hear, saw the way their eyes darted away from mine, and though no one dared accuse me openly, I could feel the weight of doubt pressing against me like a hand on the back of my neck. It was the same doubt I saw in Dante's eyes when he finally came to me one night. Not in anger, but in that terrible, quiet way of his that made everything he said sound like both a threat and a prayer. He found me in the library, where I had taken to spending my nights since sleep had become a stranger. The fire had burned low, the room bathed in an amber half-light that made everything look suspended in time. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the rain when I felt him before I heard him. That familiar shift in the air, that pulse of energy that seemed to belong only to him. "You're still awake," he said softly, his voice rough, frayed at the edges from too many nights without rest. I didn't turn. I couldn't sleep. He stepped closer, and though I couldn't see him yet, I could feel the heaviness he carried, the grief that clung to him like smoke. "Do you know what they're saying?" he asked, his tone almost conversational, though every word carried a weight that made the air colder. "Yes," I whispered. "I hear them. And? And they're wrong." Silence stretched between us, a silence so thick it almost hummed. Then finally I turned to face him. His eyes caught the firelight, dark, hollow, burning with something I couldn't name. "I want to believe you," he said, his voice low, careful, dangerous in its restraint. "I want to believe that you wouldn't hurt her. But wanting and knowing are not the same thing." I stood, the distance between us shrinking, though neither of us moved closer. "If you think I did this," I said, my voice shaking, "then say it. Say it to my face." His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "If I thought you did," he said slowly, "you wouldn't still be standing here." That truth landed between us like a blade. "Then what do you want from me?" I asked, the tears I'd been holding back finally breaking loose. "You look at me like I'm both your salvation and your punishment, and I can't keep being both." He closed the distance between us in one breath, his hand finding my wrist, his touch rough, desperate. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "But everything around me dies, Isla. Everyone I let close ends up in the ground. You saw what happened to her." "She didn't die because of you," I whispered, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. "She died because people like this, people like your father, like my father, they built a world that eats love alive." His grip loosened, his expression softening for just a moment, before hardening again, as if the tenderness itself was dangerous. "And now I'm expected to fix that world," he said, laughing without joy. "To avenge her, to clean the blood off a kingdom made of it. You don't understand what that means." "Then make me understand," I said, stepping closer. "Let me see what you're carrying before it destroys you too." He stared at me, the muscle in his jaw ticking, his breath uneven. "You don't want to see it." "I do." He exhaled sharply, a sound that was half a curse, half a surrender. Then slowly he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished, old, its surface engraved with the Moretti crest. He opened it, revealing 2 photographs, Lucia on one side, smiling faintly, and on the other, Giovanni Moretti, younger, fierce, his gaze burning even through faded ink. "She was poisoned," Dante said quietly, his thumb brushing over his mother's image. "The tests came back this morning, a slow toxin, weeks of exposure." He paused, his eyes flicking up to mine. "Do you understand what that means? It means whoever did this lived under this roof, ate at her table, spoke her name with respect." I felt the room tilt, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Dante, I swear to you—" He cut me off, his voice sharp. I know you didn't. But I also know that someone wanted me to think you did. And that's enough to start a war." I wanted to tell him not to, that vengeance wouldn't bring her back. But the look in his eyes stopped me. That hollow, quiet look of a man who had already made his decision. "I made a promise over her grave," he said, his voice low, shaking. "A blood oath. I swore I'd find whoever did it, and when I do, I'll burn everything they've ever loved." He turned away, the firelight catching on the edge of his ring, his father's ring, Lucia's legacy. I thought of the one she'd given me, still tucked away in the drawer by my bed, and it struck me then how cruel fate could be. How it bound us with symbols of loyalty, when all we'd known was betrayal. "What happens when you find them?" I asked quietly. He didn't look at me. "Then I stop being her son, and become my father." The words chilled me more than the storm outside. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but sure. "If you do this, you'll lose what little of her is left in you." He turned then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with grief, anger, and something perilously close to love. "Then stay away from me," he said, almost pleading, "because if you stay, I'll drag you down with me." "I'm not leaving," I said. "Not now. Not when you need someone to remind you who you really are." He laughed softly, bitterly, shaking his head. "You think love can save me?" "No," I said, stepping closer until I could feel his breath. "But it might stop you from killing what's left of yourself." He looked at me for a long time then, the rain outside turning to a steady rhythm against the windows, the fire burning low. Then he said, almost to himself, "God help us both." When he left, I didn't follow. I stood by the window, watching his figure vanish into the storm, knowing that whatever he did next would change everything. The mansion behind me seemed to breathe again, low, heavy, alive, as if it too could feel the war about to come. And though I didn't know it yet, that was the night everything began to unravel. The night the man I loved stopped being Dante Moretti and became the devil the world had always feared he was. There are moments when the world doesn't end, in fire or thunder, when it doesn't crumble with noise and chaos, but in the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the world itself holding its breath, afraid of what comes next. That was how it ended for us. Not with bullets or bloodshed, but with the slow unraveling of everything we had built our hearts around, until the truth stood naked and trembling between us, beautiful and unbearable. After Lucia's funeral, the days that followed bled together like watercolors left too long in the rain, blurred, colorless, dissolving into one another until time stopped feeling like something that moved forward. Dante became a ghost of himself, stalking the halls like a shadow that refused to fade, his grief calcifying into something sharper, colder. I watched him gather his men, watched the mansion transform into a war room, every whisper of strategy laced with vengeance, every plan drawn in the ink of inevitability. The Moretti Empire was preparing to rise again, and yet it felt like watching a man dig his own grave with steady, determined hands. I tried to reach him. God knows I did. But grief has a way of deafening people. And in Dante's case, it blinded him too. He'd sealed himself behind the same iron walls his father had once built, believing that control was salvation, that emotion was weakness, that the only way to survive was to become what he feared. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that if he did, he would never find his way back. The truth came, as all truths do, not like lightning, but like dawn, slow, soft, unstoppable. It was one of Dante's oldest men, Marco, who found me in the gardens one evening. The sun was setting low, casting long shadows across Lucia's grave, and I was sitting there with her ring in my hand, tracing its pattern, feeling the cold metal press into my palm, like memory made solid. "He doesn't know yet," Marco said, his voice rough with age and pity. "But he will soon. You need to hear it first." I turned to him, the dying light painting his face in gold and shadow. "What?" He sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "It wasn't you. It wasn't anyone from outside. The poison came from her medicine. The dosage was changed." I felt my stomach drop. "Changed by who?" "Her nurse." The air left my lungs in one sharp, aching rush. "Why?" He looked away. "She was paid. By the Rossi family. They wanted to start a war without firing a single bullet." I closed my eyes, the pieces falling together with cruel, precise clarity. The whispers, the timing, the fear that had hung in the air like smoke. Lucia's death hadn't been vengeance. It had been strategy. "Does Dante know?" "Not yet," Marco said quietly. "He's planning to strike tonight. When he does, it'll be the end of everything. You're the only one he might listen to." I didn't think. I just ran. Through the halls, down the stairways, past the guards who didn't dare stop me. I ran until I found him in the armory, loading a gun with that same terrifying calm that had always frightened me more than his rage. He looked up when I burst in, his eyes narrowing, his voice a low growl. "What are you doing here?" "You can't go," I said, breathless, my heart pounding. "Dante, please, you have to listen to me." He set the gun down slowly, his expression unreadable. "You should be in your room." "It wasn't me," I said. "And it wasn't anyone loyal to you. It was the nurse. The Rossis paid her to poison your mother's medicine." For a long moment, he said nothing. The room was so still I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint crackle of the distant fire. Then quietly, he said, "Who told you that?" "Marco." His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking away. "You expect me to believe an old man's rumor?" "I expect you to believe your mother," I said fiercely. "She trusted me. She wanted peace, not more death. Do you think all of this is what she wanted her son to become?" His hands trembled, just slightly, before he clenched them into fists. "You don't understand. I can't let this go. They killed her." "They used her," I said, my voice breaking. "They used you. Don't you see? That's what they want. For you to lose control, for you to become the monster they already think you are." Something flickered in his expression then. Doubt, pain, maybe both. "If I stop now," he said softly, "then she dies for nothing." "If you stop now," I whispered, stepping closer, "then she finally rests in peace." He looked at me, really looked, and I saw the war inside him. The boy who wanted his mother's forgiveness. The man who'd been raised on violence. The sinner who'd found something like salvation in love. His breath shuddered as he whispered, "You should hate me." "I tried," I said, tears spilling freely now. "But every time I do, I remember the man who reads poetry to his mother in a language she can't hear. The man who protects a woman he should have destroyed. The man who still believes, even if he can't admit it, that love might save him." He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping before he could hide it. "You're asking me to give up everything I am." "No," I said, reaching for him, pressing my hand against his chest. "I'm asking you to remember that you're more than what they made you." And then, slowly, he broke. He pulled me into his arms, holding me with a desperation that felt like both surrender and survival, his breath hot against my hair, his voice cracking as he whispered, "I don't know how to stop." "Then let me help you." We stayed like that for what felt like forever, the storm outside fading, the world narrowing to the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red but clear, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I'll find her," he said quietly. "The nurse, the Rossis. But I won't spill blood for revenge, only for truth." And he did. The days that followed were a blur of confrontation and consequence. The nurse confessed. The Rossis denied. The fragile empire trembled on its foundations but did not fall. Dante kept his promise. He did not become his father. When it was over, the house changed again. The darkness didn't vanish, but it softened, became something bearable, a scar instead of an open wound. The men still came and went, the business still ran, but there was light again. And sometimes, when the world outside was quiet and the stars were kind, I would find Dante sitting by his mother's grave, the poetry book open in his lap, his fingers tracing words she would never hear. He never said he loved me. He didn't have to. It was in every glance, every silence, every act of gentleness that defied the man he was supposed to be. And I stayed. Not because I was trapped, not because I was blind, but because love, I learned, is not about saving someone from their darkness. It's about standing beside them and reminding them that even in the dark, they are not alone. Now, when I walk the halls of the mansion, I hear her still. Lucia, laughing softly in memory, her hands signing words that only my heart seems to understand. You must teach him that love is survival. And I think maybe I have. Because the house no longer breathes in sorrow, but in something softer, something like forgiveness. And in the quiet, I can almost believe that love, once cursed and buried beneath blood, has found a way to live again. Some stories don't end with happily ever after. I whisper sometimes, when the rain begins to fall the way it did the night we first kissed. They end with the sound of two people still trying. And maybe that's all love ever is. Not a fairy tale, but the brave, impossible act of trying again in a world built to break you.